A recent Roanoke College poll shows a very close contest in Virginia, of all places, while polling in other swing states has been drifting away from Donald Trump. So this poll is very interesting because Donald Trump is only down in Virginia by 3 points. Now, for perspective, Donald Trump lost Virginia by 10 in 2020 and by over 5 points in 2016. So far the polling indicates that Donald Trump is doing better in Virginia than his previous 2 runs for president. And again, that's based on just this poll alone. So we're going to talk about what the implications for this poll are, whether or not Virginia is actually competitive in 2024 with Harris as the nominee, and ultimately what this means going forward for the 2024 contest, because we're now less than 75 days away from Election Day, and early voting in a lot of states is going to be starting soon. So Election Day is really right around the corner. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this Roanoke College poll has Donald Trump at 44% of the vote to Kamala Harris's 47%. When you include candidates like RFK, Jill Stein, so on and so forth, you get Donald Trump at 42% and Kamala Harris at 45%. Now, interestingly enough, there is a significant gap between the presidential polling and the Senate polling, because when it comes to the Senate contest between Tim Kaine and Hung Cao, Tim Kaine is up 49%, and Cao is at 38%. So an 11-point margin of victory for Tim Kaine, according to this poll, and just a 3-point margin of victory for Kamala Harris in this poll. So it is pretty interesting that this poll sort of bucks the trend of other polls we've seen around the country where Donald Trump has been significantly behind Kamala Harris, or has been much more competitive than he was when Joe Biden was the nominee. In places like Michigan, for example, Kamala Harris is now up by several points in the average. Wisconsin, Nevada polling has been very poor for Donald Trump lately, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. So Donald Trump being at 44% here really shouldn't be that surprising when you put into perspective that in 2016, Donald Trump got 44.4% of the vote, and in 2020, Donald Trump also got 44% of the vote. So under Donald Trump, Republicans have gotten only 44% of the vote in Virginia. Now, for context, Romney got about 47 in 2012, and John McCain got around 46 in 2008. So Donald Trump has performed the worst for a Republican nominee in 2020 since 1948. So that goes to show you just how bad Republicans have slid in Virginia over the past couple of cycles, and especially under Donald Trump. Because just 2 years before 2016, you had Republicans lose a competitive Senate race by around a point or so, despite polling indicating they were going to lose by around 9 or 10 to Mark Warner, and that was against Ed Gillespie. So in terms of federal races, that's the last time Republicans have been competitive in Virginia to a real point. Now, obviously, statewide, it's a bit different. Obviously, in 2021, we had an upset victory by Glenn Youngkin against Terry McAuliffe. And I say upset because Republicans were really the underdogs throughout most of this race. It was only in the last couple of weeks that Glenn Youngkin was starting to be seen as the favorite. But in Virginia, generally speaking, Democrats have a fundamental advantage because they have a massive base of support in Northern Virginia, these suburbs around D.C. Now, these Northern Virginia suburbs, when Virginia was a red state, voted for Republican candidates. In 2000, for example, George W. Bush won Loudoun, Fairfax, and Prince William counties. And of course, in 2004, he was able to win Loudoun, Prince William, and he lost Fairfax quite narrowly by today's standards. So that base of support, that rock-solid turnout base that Democrats have in Northern Virginia, basically cancels out Republican gains in the rest of the state. Because when Democrats have high margins and high turnout in Northern Virginia, there isn't the population in the rest of the state or the numbers Republicans need to be able to flip the state. Now, 2021 was the rare exception to that. Again, this was before the Dobbs decision. This was before Democrats had massive turnout advantages because of abortion. So this is when you had Biden fatigue across the country. Joe Biden's popularity was slipping in many states, and in Virginia, I think he was underwater by 9 points on Election Day. Glenn Youngkin was really the perfect candidate for the Republican Party in Virginia because he had just enough suburban appeal in Northern Virginia to allow for higher Republican margins in the rest of the state to carry him to around a 63,000 vote victory against Terry McAuliffe. And Terry McAuliffe was a former governor, had previously won back in 2013, so it's not exactly like he was going up against some no-name Republican. So Virginia Republicans obviously were very energized and excited in this election. And I think Glenn Youngkin's victory here really turned the page for the GOP in Virginia, because now Virginia Republicans actually had a strategy to win statewide. The only problem is Donald Trump is the worst type of Republican to run in Virginia. And that's why, even despite Biden doing bad in other parts of the country, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, states that were previously more leftward voting of Virginia, Virginia still had the polling within the margin of error for Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden actually was down right before he dropped out by 0.4%. So again, very, very tiny margin there. But look at the percentage of the vote that both candidates get. Donald Trump is basically at 44%. Joe Biden was dragged under 44%. So Donald Trump has really failed to get over 45, 46% of the vote in any of the latest polls. I mean, you have to go back to a Fox News poll in June to get Donald Trump at 48% of the vote. So it's very hard for somebody like Donald Trump to get those margins because Northern Virginia is just so opposed to Donald Trump and his style of politics. That's why you saw such massive trends towards the left in these heavily populated suburban counties. Loudoun County, for example, went to Barack Obama by just 4.5% and then ended up voting for Hillary Clinton by 55% to 38%. So a massive swing in Loudoun County. Prince William County, you saw less of a swing, but still a swing to the left. And in Fairfax County, you went from Mitt Romney getting 39% of the vote here to Donald Trump just getting 28% of the vote. So you saw massive slides away from the GOP in Northern Virginia. Had Donald Trump got the margins that Mitt Romney did in Northern Virginia and held his own in the rest of the state, he would have carried Virginia in 2016. So this suburban slide, which has been happening all over the country, Virginia is really the poster child of that for the GOP. Virginia's suburban counties turned Virginia into a red state in the mid-20th century, and it turned Virginia into a blue state in the 21st century. So in order for somebody like Donald Trump to win in Virginia, he would have to make inroads in these Northern Virginia suburbs. And there's really no evidence based on any polling that that's happened. If Donald Trump does gain in the state and, shrinks the Democrats' margin of victory, it's going to be because he's doing even better in these rural Virginia counties and potentially winning back some support in more conservative-leaning suburbs, places like, James City County, York County, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, these Hampton Roads, these more conservative, southern, culturally speaking areas of the state. That's where Donald Trump would have to do better and probably would do better in a scenario where he narrows the gap between himself and Kamala Harris. I don't see him making any significant inroads in Northern Virginia. Now, the Virginia GOP has a much better political operation than it did, say, back in 2020, when the state was essentially abandoned by the Republican Party. There really was no opportunities for growth here. But after 2021, there's been a new spark of life in the Virginia GOP. And I think even though Republicans are going to lose Virginia in 2024, I don't think it's impossible for them to potentially win the state in, say, 2028, because if Republicans were to, say, win Virginia, they wouldn't have to win Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. They would only need to hold on to Arizona and Nevada, and could even lose Nevada, would just need to hold on to Arizona and Georgia. That would put them at 275 electoral votes. So I think the Republicans' investment in Virginia is more so a long-term strategy rather than a short one, because I think in 2024, with somebody like Donald Trump, who again is just the worst candidate to try and win over suburban moderate voters in places like Northern Virginia, if you had somebody like Marco Rubio, Nikki Haley, Glenn Youngkin, I think they could make significant inroads in Northern Virginia. You have a rapidly growing Asian and Hispanic population here, so you need a candidate that's going to get much better margins with those voting groups in order to win statewide. Because again, these are highly educated voters, and these voters are the types of voters who come out in every single election, not just presidential, but also in other statewide contests. That's why Republicans really haven't won a statewide race between 2009 and 2021, because they just couldn't make up ground in Northern Virginia and the rest of the state enough to win. So Kamala Harris only winning in Virginia by 3 points could be a sign potentially of her weakness in the South more broadly. Again, Virginia is still sort of a southern state, even though it's a blue state now. Most of the state geographically is culturally very southern. So this could have potential implications for states like Georgia and North Carolina. But ultimately, Virginia is still going to go blue in 2024 no matter what. It really doesn't matter what Donald Trump does. I don't think he has any chance of winning here. His path of victory is solely confined to the Rust Belt. You would need a different Republican candidate in a different political paradigm in order to make Virginia the competitive tipping point state that it maybe was seen back in 2012, for example. But we really can't say anything definitively until we get more polls out of the state. Since Kamala Harris has been the Democratic nominee, we've really only had 2 polls out of Virginia, one that has her up by 5, one that has her up by 3. So we're going to need a couple of polls with potentially a bigger sample size in order to really determine where Virginia is headed. Because at this point in time, it's not impossible for Donald Trump to narrow the Democratic margin by maybe, bringing it down 8 or 7 points. So a 7-point margin of victory for Democrats would still be a pretty decisive one, but it would show that the GOP in the state has been gaining some ground. And I think the areas they would gain ground in that scenario would be places like Stafford, would be places like Virginia Beach, would be places like Chesapeake, places that already voted for Donald Trump back in 2016, but gave Joe Biden narrow margins of victory in 2020. Those are the places that Republicans need to target in the future. Again, not in 2024, because I think Virginia is sort of a lost cause when it comes to the federal races for the GOP. But there are some very important House races in Virginia that I think Republicans need to invest a lot into. You have Virginia 2nd down here by Virginia Beach and Hampton Roads, and you have Virginia 7th, which basically includes Stafford County and goes all the way into northern Richmond. So those are the races that I think the GOP is going to pump a lot of effort into. And, that could potentially have some implications on the presidential margin as a whole. You could see those counties get dragged more towards the center. But overall, Virginia, I don't think is going to be that competitive, although it will be interesting to see in November what the actual margin is, because that could really determine how much potential there is for the Republicans in the post-Trump GOP. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.